Many have forgotten about this, but during the ancient era of YouTube, there was a prominent atheist movement all over the website and really all over the internet. This movement dominated the discourse around religion for a period of around 4 to 5 years, roughly around 2008 to 2012. And sure, while the last remnants of this movement really boiled down to a couple of fedora memes, I thought it would be a good idea to make a video covering the geography of irreligiosity. After all, I had made a video previously on the geography of religion, so why not do a video on the lack of religion? I do want to preface this point by stating that the video is not about theology. I repeat, not about theology. So whether you are religious, atheist, or something else, you are welcome here. I'm not here to preach any belief or lack of belief to you, but rather understand how beliefs map out on the world. I want to preface this that while this video is cited the geography of atheism, it is really more about the geography of irreligion. Not all people who are atheists are irreligious, and vice versa. There are atheists who may hold other types of supernatural or spiritual beliefs, or may subscribe to a particular religion that doesn't require a belief in God, like some forms of Buddhism. Likewise, there are some people who don't identify with organized religions, but may believe in some sort of deity, and therefore are irreligious but not atheists. Now, keep in mind that I'm not going to focus too much on apatheistic religions like some forms of Buddhism here. I'm going to focus more on the broad subject of irreligion. So pop open a can of Mountain Dew, scruff your neckbeards, and tip your fedoras. This is the geography of irreligion. So, let's start off with one part of the world you're all familiar with, Europe. After all, whether we'd like to admit it or not, or for better or for worse, the modern world is a product of Europe, or more specifically, Western Europe. While once being the beating center of Christendom, unless you count Jerusalem, Europe is now becoming far less religious. Now, Christianity still plays a very important role in the core foundations and institutions and cultures of this region, as well as its iconography and art, which can be found in nearly every European capital. However, religion, namely Christianity, has played less and less of an important role in people's everyday lives, with a few exceptions. Church attendance in most European countries has declined, as the number of people who say that religion plays a very important role in their lives. If you look at the value systems of Western Europe, you'll see that they're overwhelmingly secular in nature. People base their morals not on the authority of religious texts, but rather upon what reduces harm or what is fair or free. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt has noted that by and large secular people base their views and ethics on three main pillars: freedom, fairness, and harm reduction, whereas religious people, while also caring about those previously mentioned three factors, also tend to place a lot more emphasis and value on authority and purity. As a result of these changing value systems, you see far more lax attitudes towards sexuality in particular, especially in regards to the LGBT community, as well as openness to women's reproductive rights, or more controversially, abortion and sex work. France, in particular, is notorious for its militant secularism. Unlike the English-speaking world's version of secularism, the French broke off relations from the clergy far more antagonistically during the French Revolution, with anti-clerical violence due to the Jacobins, and this can still be seen to some degree today with, say, the anti-religious cartoons of Charlie Hebdo. There are many explanations as to why Europe has secularized so rapidly. Some people have argued that it's due to the horrors of World War II. It's oftentimes difficult to reconcile the idea of a loving God with the bloodshed that erupted throughout much of the 20th century. However, I'm not particularly convinced by this argument, as many places deal with violence more regularly and are still deeply religious. At the same time, the one most deeply religious European country is Poland, which is still predominantly very Catholic. Poland had quite possibly the bloodiest history of any European country during the 20th century, being the battleground between the Germans and the Soviet Union, etc. Others claim that science is a key factor, but the United States is very scientifically advanced, and produces more technological output than Europe, yet is more religious. Another argument that I find personally more convincing is that social democracy, or the welfare state, or the social safety net, has led most European countries to basically decrease their religiosity, as people no longer have to be dependent on churches for charity and social support. It is also important to note that religion isn't simply a groundwork of beliefs, it's also a community. And while many celebrate the decline of organized religion in Europe, it's also important to note that the decline in Europe in church attendance has also led to the decline of people interacting with each other socially. Nonetheless, the decline of religion has not spelled doom and gloom for much of the secular world in Europe. Namely, the Scandinavian countries have some of the lowest attendances of churches in the continent. These countries were once traditionally Lutheran, but by and large are very irreligious today. And they have some of the highest standards of living and lowest crime rates in the world. And again, I suspect that this is probably because the Scandinavian countries have the strongest social safety nets. Other countries like the UK are also very secular, but funny enough, the UK is one of the few modern nations that actually has its official church/religion, the Anglican Church, which broke off from Catholicism due to King Henry VIII wanting to bang some more wives. Nonetheless, the Anglican Church today is considered to be one of the most progressive churches in the world, and quite socially liberal in terms of its attitudes. Some will see this as progress, others as heresy. It's worth pointing out that many of the traditionally Protestant nations tend to be more secular than their Catholic counterparts. For example, if we move southward from the UK into Spain and Italy, or for that matter, Eastern Orthodox countries like Greece, tend to be rather less secular than their historically Protestant counterparts. I'm unaware of any concrete explanation as to why this is the case, but part of me believes that Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions tend to have a lot more of a rich culture around, say, traditions and rituals, which are not as common in the Protestant world. Let's keep it real, I'd rather party in Spain than in Wales. But again, I'm unaware of any concrete explanation. I will point out that while Europe has become far more secularized, nonetheless, secularism, by and large, has made way for cultural Christianity, which involves valuing and respecting the traditions and the human elements of Christianity without, by and large, believing many of the supernatural tenets. This has especially come to fruition with the rise of quote-unquote wokeness and Islamic migration. Many secular Europeans view Christianity as a sort of bulwark to protect them from these forces. Anyway, the most irreligious country on the European continent is the Czech Republic, formerly part of Czechoslovakia. This country was once part of the Warsaw Pact, and was once communist, and communism played an essential role as a meta-narrative, replacing Christianity and much of Eastern Europe throughout much of the 20th century. While communism collapsed as a meta-narrative, some countries like Poland returned to their Catholic roots. Others returned to their Eastern Orthodox roots, such as the Czech Republic, and became deeply secular. Another major factor has been Islam. There has been a rise of Islamic migration, which tends to be a very thorny issue on the continent to this day, as many migrants from the Muslim world hold views on gender and sexuality that conflict with Europe's modern secularism. It is worth pointing out that the first officially atheist country in the world was Albania, a Muslim-majority country, which brings me to the subject of former communist states, namely Russia. It's widely known that the Soviet Union, which was communist Russia and its satellite states, had become the USSR, which were communist, and many by and large persecuted organized religion. Communism was seen as the premier meta-narrative of these nations, and oftentimes you saw the same sort of anti-religious violence. This can be seen in much of socialist art, the statues, the iconography, and the reverence to the great leader. Oftentimes communism was treated as a replacement for religion, showing that oftentimes people who are atheists, who aren't necessarily basing their beliefs off of pure rationalism, can pick a new sort of quasi-religion. Anyway, when the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 following it, and the meta-narrative communism collapsed along with it. As in the aftermath of that, many people in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia, were searching for something else to fill in the void with the downfall of communism. Some rich Russians went for hedonism and burned their money on yachts and hookers, and yachts filled with hookers. Others resorted to nihilism, drinking themselves to death, as deaths of despair increased throughout much of the 90s in Russia. However, many Russians turned to the old ways, namely Russian nationalism and imperialism, as well as Eastern Orthodox Christianity. There's been a resurgence in religious interest throughout much of the former communist countries now that communism is pretty much dead. However, the transition has not been completely smooth. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church supported it, whereas the Eastern Orthodox Church from Ukraine clearly did not. In fact, many Ukrainians are now celebrating Christmas on the 25th, like Catholics and Protestants, rather than in January, like most Orthodox Christians. As we move further east, another country that has gone through communism but since then has removed it is one you may or may not have heard of. It's rather obscure. It's called China. It's important to note that when discussing religion in East Asia, you're dealing with a very different context than what goes on in Europe, the Americas, or the Middle East. The concepts of what constitute religion are by and large very different than what we typically use. So please take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. Traditionally, China has had a whole host of religious worldviews, philosophies, and practices that are incredibly complex, and oftentimes merge into what we call Chinese syncretism. On top of that, you have the religion of Taoism or Taoism, most famous for yin and yang. You also have the importance of Buddhism, which dates back to the Indian subcontinent. And you have Confucianism, which is sometimes considered a religion, even though in my view it's really more of a social and political philosophy. Nonetheless, when the Chinese Communist Party defeated the Chinese nationalists and the Japanese in the aftermath of World War II and the Civil War following World War II, they implemented communism. And in many cases, the religious fervor of previous eras were replaced with the fervor of Maoism and communism. The most well-known example of this anti-religious fervor was its approach to Buddhism. You had the region of Tibet, which was eventually taken over by the Chinese Communist Party a year after the CCP had taken control of China, with the Dalai Lama seeking refuge in India, which still exists to this day. However, anti-religious attitudes and communist attitudes in general have decreased over the past several decades. When Mao passed away, many of his successors were more pragmatic, moving towards state capitalism, and while they are still authoritarian, they by and large are not particularly totalitarian when it comes to people's religious beliefs, and have become more lenient, particularly when it comes to Christianity, which has rapidly grown in China. However, there have been some scuffles between the Chinese Communist Party and the Vatican over the appointment of priests and bishops. Granted, while Christianity has done fairly well in China compared to other religions, namely the cult of Falun Gong, there are still many groups that are widely persecuted in China. The most infamously are the Uyghurs, who are a Muslim ethnic group of Turkic-speaking peoples in northwest China. As we move further east, we get to the Korean Peninsula. North Korea is fairly similar to China in its persecution of religion, albeit far worse, because hey, it's North Korea. But I suppose you could argue that Kim Jong-un is still kind of like a god. I mean, he has superpowers, he doesn't have an asshole. So I'd expect a god not to have an asshole, according to North Korean propaganda. So let's move on to South Korea, which is a little bit more interesting. South Korea, like many East Asian countries, has its own religious traditions and its own polytheistic canon historically. However, today most of the country is split by various other groups, namely Buddhists, Protestant Christians, and secularists. It's not a surprise why Buddhism spread so rapidly in the Korean Peninsula, but Protestant Christianity was a relative new import, arriving during the 18 and 1900s due primarily to American missionaries who were by and large Protestant. Today, South Korea produces one of the highest rates of preachers and pastors in the world. Nonetheless, there are still portions of Korea that are by and large very secular. You know what country is also deeply secular? Japan. Historically, Japan's religions have been a mix of Shintoism, an animistic religion native to the islands, as well as Buddhism. Christianity also had a brief stint on these set of islands, but they eventually faded away. At the end of the day, it's very difficult to explain the Japanese mindset when it comes to religion or irreligion, as many of them practice religious traditions but don't necessarily believe in the supernatural. Some believe in gods and not in spirits, or vice versa, and oftentimes the definitions are really shaky. This is an example of oftentimes how the way Westerners view a certain subject can be very different than other people groups, even people groups with very advanced cultures. Understanding irreligiosity in Japan is just too difficult to decipher and probably deserves its own video. You may have people who identify as Shintoists but don't believe in anything supernatural, and may still practice all the rituals and call themselves atheists. It's complicated. Moving further south to Southeast Asia, you get more developing countries, and like much of the developing world, religion is fairly common and irreligiosity is less common. In the Philippines, we get overwhelming Catholicism. Indonesia and Malaysia are overwhelmingly Muslim. Thailand is overwhelmingly Buddhist, though again, Buddhism's relationship with theology is tenuous. As you move further down south, you get to Australia and New Zealand. These two countries have faced a similar set of circumstances that you see in Europe, and by and large have become fairly secular despite their Protestant roots. To the Indian subcontinent, we get to an area that is really messy. The Indian subcontinent and its views on religion and philosophy are a universe unto themselves in a way that I can't really scratch the surface of. Overall, rates of secularism are pretty low, even among the predominantly Hindu community. In fact, if you look at countries with the lowest rates of religiosity, Bangladesh is actually at the top of the list, or I suppose the bottom of the list, as is quite possibly the most religious country in the world, with the lowest number of atheists. And it's not a surprise that Bangladesh is predominantly Muslim. As India economically grows rapidly, it will be interesting to see if rates of secularism increase drastically in this country as they have in Europe, or perhaps if they move in another direction. After all, their concepts of beliefs and non-beliefs are rather different than those in the West. If we move further west, but still not being Western, we get to the Middle East and North Africa, areas that are quite notorious for their supposed excess religiosity. Unsurprisingly, this part of the world is predominantly Islamic. And it's not a surprise, in this area you have very low rates of irreligiosity as well. However, it's important to note that in many Muslim-majority countries, apostasy or leaving Islam is punishable by death, and as a result, there are wide swaths of people who don't identify as being religious or Muslim, but by and large will not be particularly open about it for fear of retribution or persecution by the state. There are also many blasphemy laws that prevent criticism of Islam. For example, in a country like Iran, which is run by a Shiite fundamentalist government, there are some polls showing that somewhere between 40 to 60% of people don't even identify as being Muslim. This may not necessarily be due to some sort of anti-religious fervor, but by and large the product of Iran's historical religion being Zoroastrianism, as many Persians namely view Islam as being a foreign Arabic import. Another factor is that because of the government of Iran, the Islamic Republic is notorious for being very repressive and uses morality police to enforce Islamic dogma, particularly on women and religious minorities, many Iranian people have become secular humanists. It's difficult again to tell to what extent the numbers are credible, though. Overall, due to heavy censorship and government repression and religious intolerance, we really don't know for sure, but it probably is underreported. And this is unsurprising. If you look at pictures of, say, women in Egypt during the 1950s and 60s, you will see that many of them were walking around with their hair flowing. However, by the 1980s, many people around the Middle East became more religiously observant. This probably has less to do with a lack of belief in God, and more to do with the decline of Arab nationalism and the rise of Islamism. And of course, I have to bring up the subject of Israel, as everyone just really is capable of having a sensible conversation on that subject. Anyway, Israel is the only Jewish state in the world. However, Israel is by and large secular by law. In fact, the founder of the Zionist Council in Switzerland during the 1800s, Theodor Herzl, was an atheist. Israel today is deeply divided between secular and Orthodox Jewish lines, with many secular Jews viewing the ultra-Orthodox Jews as being backward reactionaries, not contributing their dues to the military and economy, whereas many ultra-Orthodox Jews view secular Jews as not being true Jews. The high rates of religiosity among Orthodox Jews, and to a lesser extent secular Jews, may be one of the reasons why Israel has a relatively higher birth rate than most other developed nations. And this could be in part due to why religion has been so successful. People who are religious tend to engage in a lot of baby making more so than secular people. So if you're an atheist and you want to spread atheism, make more babies. It's kind of fun how evolution tends to favor religion in that way. Isn't it a little bit of a weird quirk? Anyway, as you move further down south, beyond the Middle East, into a continent you may have heard of, Africa, or more accurately sub-Saharan Africa, you see far less secularism. Africa is still predominantly rural, and it's not as educated and doesn't have as much access to information. And by and large, religion is very popular as a form of social cohesion. After all, people tend to believe in the belief systems that they were brought up with. After all, there's really not much to say about irreligiosity in the African continent, due to a lack of information. It'd be interesting to see if irreligiosity ends up expanding over the next coming decades. So, let's move on across the Atlantic into the Americas. Let's start off with the good old US of A. Until very recently, the US was the major outlier in the developed world when it came to religiosity, with a few exceptions, like Poland. The US still maintains relatively high church attendance, but by and large is far more religious than Europeans. More Americans say that religion plays an important role in their lives, and more attend church. However, it's important to note that the US has not been a concrete outlier, but rather late to the same sort of trends that you've seen in the rest of the developed world. While the US during the 2000s was significantly more religious than Europe, the gap has massively narrowed, as many people in the United States, namely the generations of millennials and zoomers, are far less religious than their boomer and Gen X counterparts, which has resulted in a rapid secularization in the country. There are many explanations for this. Some point to the internet, some point to the various cultures that people have interacted with that are quite different than their own faiths that they grew up with. So it doesn't seem to be that the US possesses some sort of special exception, but rather it was by and large slow to the overall trend. Funny enough, the most secular parts of the country are parts of the country that were founded by religious fanatics. For example, New England and Massachusetts was founded by Puritans. However, today it's one of the most secular parts of the country, and some argue that this is due to high education rates. However, it's worth pointing out that the mandatory education and critical role education plays in New England was first implemented by fanatical Puritans. If you move further west, you get to, you guessed it, the western United States. Surprise, surprise. States like Washington State, Oregon, and parts of California, and even some Republican states like Idaho, tend to be called the unchurched belt. This is in sharp contrast to other parts of the country like the Bible Belt or Utah, which are still very religious. However, and even in those cases, they're becoming more secularized just at a slower pace. Let's move on to Canada, a fairly secular country. Quebec was once deeply Catholic, but today has changed. And the western coast of Canada is still by and large fairly secularized, however, not to the same extent that you see in Europe. It's worth pointing out that many Western countries have seen Christianity in decline. However, many immigrants have brought in their religions from the developing world, and many of these immigrants are still very religious. This may include Christian immigrants from, say, the Philippines or Jamaica, or it can include Muslim migrants from the Middle East, or perhaps Hindu immigrants from India. As we move further south, we get to Latin America. This part of the world is still predominantly Catholic, and rates of irreligiosity are not as high as they are in Europe or China. However, they're certainly higher than what you see in the Indian subcontinent or sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East. The most secular country in the Americas is, in fact, Uruguay. I couldn't think of any reason why Uruguay is the most secular country in the Americas, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing the name of the country correctly. So I'm just going to end it there. That's it. That's the geography of irreligion. Thanks for watching. Bye.